My name is Mary Lobson, and I'm the founder of REES. Welcome to the REES Community. This is a show all about innovation, promising practices, and best practices in the area of harm prevention. Join me as we chat across sectors and industries with people who are making change, creating impact, and shifting culture. I'm very excited on our first podcast to have joining me Camille Schoeffel. Camille is based in Australia. She is a survivor, activist, social worker, and sexual violence prevention expert. There is so many things that we're going to have opportunity to talk about today. I'm thrilled. You're the founder of the STOP Campaign. You're a Churchill Fellow. You've been engaged as a student and activist in so many different ways, and really focusing on addressing and preventing sexual violence in Australia. So welcome. It's great to have you here, and I'm super excited.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess we met. Well, I'll just kind of lay the foundation for how we got connected. So you are a Churchill Fellow. Tell me a little bit about what that is and how we cross paths.
Yeah, so I was awarded a Churchill Fellowship in 2020, and I was finally able to travel in 2022. And the whole purpose of mine was really to look at ways that activists and universities work together and collaborate to prevent sexual violence on campus, particularly from my perspective, as particularly around the time I was applying. I only just finished university and I'd been really involved in activism, mostly with the STOP campaign, and was experiencing a lot of barriers to change with Australian universities here. So I ended up in 2022 going to the US, Canada, and the UK for about 11 weeks and spoke to a really wide variety of people. And it was awesome to connect with you and Reese, because the Reese team, because I was finding that so many people I would meet along the way. So I met with another survivor activist based in Toronto, and they said, "Oh my gosh, you have to connect with Reese." And that happened a lot with a lot of the people I met. So I almost spoke to double the people that I planned in the end. So it was 120 conversations over that time period, which was just amazing. So a lot of my fellowship was trying to talk to as many people as possible with lots of different backgrounds within the unis, but also outside of the unis. So lots of different expertise and perspectives coming through.
Well, that's really an amazing opportunity to connect across countries, across regions, right? I think no matter where you go in college, university, there are versions of sexual violence experience that are very similar. The prevention initiatives, they may look a little bit different, and sometimes there's nuanced language and stuff, but this is a prevalent issue across schools pretty much everywhere. And I can imagine that as you started connecting with people, they'd be saying, "Oh, you need to talk to so and so, and you
Oh
need to
yeah.
talk to." Well, and I can imagine there was lots of that going on. Were there any kind of key takeaways? I know you have a blog, so people can certainly check out your blog. There's all the blog posts that you did from so many of the folks that you met with. But were there any really key takeaways for you and your learnings from that experience?
Yeah, there was a lot. So I knew that the statistics of prevalence was also very high in the regions that I was traveling to. So I really tried not to get my hopes up too much about finding really amazing work, but I was actually surprised at how much positive work was going on, particularly within the US and Canada, that I didn't know too much about. I mean, as you're in Australia, you hear about Title IX, you've seen some of the big campaigns, perhaps like End Rape on Campus. But it seemed like there was also a lot of work to be done. So it was just really interesting because across all the regions that I went to, even though people were doing things very differently based on the context of where they were based, there was a lot of similarities in the way that they were organizing or the values that they held in their work where it was effective. And I particularly found it interesting, and this happened in Canada as well, is that there was actually a fair bit of investment from universities in prevention, like sexual violence prevention and response teams, where there were whole teams of social workers and prevention experts, up to like 30 paid staff and all these volunteers within institutions working towards creating a safer culture on campus. So I found that really interesting. So the biggest that's what led me to end up doing the blogs, because there were so many. I mean, it's still pockets of good, I will say.
Absolutely.
There was nothing around national consistency. That's what everyone wanted.
Yeah.
So that's why a lot of my recommendations are around government intervention,
Mhm.
national consistency, legal reform,
Yeah.
because a lot of what I saw was pockets of really good practice, and institutions really leading the way, or external organizations like REES, who were basically doing this and trying to get in as many spaces and places as possible to
Mhm.
create that level of consistency. And of course, in your space, it's more around reporting. But the
Mhm.
key kind of themes that came out were that there were seven pillars, I guess, or principles for effective prevention,
Mhm.
and they were really strong across all of the places that were doing really well. So the first one was comprehensive. So when they're investing and they're addressing primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, things
Mhm.
were going a lot better. And then there was collaborative. So when there was particularly, and I saw this in places like the University of Michigan, where there were lots of different parts of the university and the community all working together and had a really coordinated response. And that was
Yep.
really positive. And they engaged victim survivors as well. And
Mhm.
then trauma informed seems obvious, but it's like a word that's thrown around a lot, but not necessarily implemented. But when it was done well, it seemed to have a much, um, I guess, more impact, and there seemed to be a much more positive. I guess when I spoke to student survivors and activists, they had a lot better things to say when the universities were conducting themselves in trauma informed ways when
Mhm.
delivering their services. And then intersectional was a big one. So a lot of people I spoke to were bringing up how you can't really address sexual violence unless you're also addressing racism, and a lot of how the systems in place are very oppressive to lots of
Mhm.
people in different ways, towards lots of communities, but particularly anti-racist practice was a big one there.
Mhm.
And then going a step further that Australia doesn't touch, is anti-oppressive.
Mhm.
So not just recognizing how people experience the system differently, but doing something about it to have more shared power and to be able to change those systems and cater services to people's unique needs. And then the last two were feminist, and then person centered. So trying to see people as the whole person, but also keeping those, the gendered nature of sexual violence in view. So that's like my whole Churchill in a nutshell is basically recommendations around government intervention, um,
Mhm.
like genuine wild scale
Yeah.
reform, but then utilizing all those principles, because otherwise implementation just
Yeah.
will
Yeah.
fail.
It's really an amazing opportunity, and certainly, um, props to the Churchill Fellowship, for prioritizing
Mm.
this in a way that I think certainly, the intention was around, how to perhaps, um do things better in Australia, but the impacts of your work really are they're not just about Australia. They can be applied, in any context, anywhere for any school. So I think that's for me is something that's so exciting. Um, I want to talk a little bit about the STOP campaign
Mm.
because, in addition to the many things that you have done, one of them is being the founder of an organization called the STOP Campaign, and I'd like to hear more about kind of what it was or what it is, and kind of what got you started, what your intention was, and what activism looked like for you as a student.
Yeah, so it was back in 2018, and I was a couple of years into uni, And we had the previous year in 2017, a Human Rights Commission National Student Safety Survey results were released. And I remember actually in my first year of university filling out this survey, and it was basically looking at the prevalence of sexual violence on campus across all universities. So that was an Australian first to basically look at what was happening on campus. And when those results came out in 2017, unsurprisingly, the university that I was studying at, the Australian National University, had the highest rates of sexual harassment in the country and the second highest of sexual assault. So the ANU, the university I was at the time, is very different compared to lots of other universities because it's got the highest number of colleges and on-campus living.
Yeah.
So that really changes, I guess, people's experiences of on campus. It's a lot more American in a lot of ways. And during the time that there was a lot of growth of these on campus living colleges, we did have an American vice chancellor who was really leading that and wanting it to be more like an American university experience. So, but with that comes responsibility, and the university took no responsibility in actually keeping students safe, while also establishing a lot of different colleges, and that was a really big part of university life. So it just led me to being really horrified but not surprised because I would receive disclosure after disclosure, supporting friends, and I was in a student leadership position by this point in the beginning of 2018. And because I had greater access to staff, because I was now in a student leadership position, I would try and bring up these conversations about, so are we going to talk about responding to disclosures to support, because sexual violence is happening all the time. Like there'll be like a couple at this event and then there's a big drink spiking at this event. I was just like, every week there's heaps.
Problem. Yeah.
And I would have at least one disclosure at least once a week in a college of only 400 people. That's a lot of people because I'm only receiving one, and there'd be a lot of other peers who would also be experiencing this as well. And they just weren't interested. So I decided to go and talk to every single women's officer in all of the colleges and ask them about what they thought about starting some sort of campaign. And overwhelmingly, they were pretty supportive. So that's kind of how it started. So it was all just about awareness raising and responding to disclosures. So it really started about supporting the supporters to then be able to support their peers. And at the time, the way that sexual violence reporting worked at the uni is there was one person for the whole university who was the registrar that had to handle every single disclosure and complaint. It was an impossible job, but also they were not doing it in any of those principles I described before. And it was just, yeah, it was just horrible. So I just kept building lots and lots of momentum, and it kind of turned into a story sharing empowerment campaign where a lot of people, we started a blog, people would share their experiences of sexual violence or sexual well-being, so like positive sexual experience to kind of like destigmatize talking about sex, but then also talk about their experiences of assault or their experience of telling someone. And then we decided to do, as a team of volunteers, we decided to create a video series and a blog. A zine based on a lot of these submissions. So that ended up, I think we got about 28 victim
Mhm.
survivor stories, and we ended up sharing those. And it just it annoyed the uni, but it definitely built awareness. And then over time, I think once you start to be in this space, you just realize that awareness it's not enough. So we just kept trying to do more and more and more. And we ended up then developing a primary prevention program to deliver in the colleges. We did an empowerment program with victim survivors as well, with community support from different expert organizations. We did another video series and more blogs. And then last year, after about 6 or 5.5 years, we decided to then move into the more campaigning realm. And that's where we started calling on some more national systemic reform, because despite what we were doing, we were having really great results in our little pocket, but then we were still experiencing so much targeting, backlash, bullying, all of it from university leadership. They just would not stop trying to tear us down. So we just knew that we needed more. So we started to go a bit more national. So we've been all over the place,
Yeah.
honestly. So many
Yeah.
organizations have their one thing, and every year we'd almost like trial something else and then
Mhm.
kind of have that, so that we were building a lot of evidence base really, and trying to evaluate everything that we've done as well, to be able to share that with other people and organizations to do the same.
Well, and I think the opportunity to be creative in this space and innovate in this space and think about, okay, what's been done? What can we do differently when we think about prevention? It's work that is that we wish nobody needed to do, right? We wish this wasn't an issue. We wish we
I
weren't talking.
know. We don't want jobs. That's our ultimate goal. We don't wanna have to do
We
this
want to
anymore.
put ourselves out of work and go do something else.
Yeah.
Um, but until that time, it is um, it's it's encouraging to be able to think about what more can we do and how can we do things differently and how can we innovate and how can we make meaningful change or contribute to the meaningful change that we see happening around us. Um, I think you mentioned that it was about 6 years. So you recently stepped down from your role there, right?
I did. Well, we've been through a bit of a it's been interesting. So I've been working towards leaving, because I'm 27, and some of the younger members are like, "Camille, you're so old." And I'm just not a peer anymore.
Mhm. Yeah.
When like in terms of the undergraduate, I know a lot of campaigns are more broad. They have students of all
Mhm.
ages and all types of degrees, but we're ultimately an undergraduate student
Mhm.
organization. And because we're so focused on colleges and student living, which like
Mhm.
80% is under 21.
Yeah.
So I've been basically was working with the board to transition out, and we were doing that, but we just really struggled to retain people. So I've been asked by the board to jump back in
Oh, oh,
for a little bit,
mhm.
mostly to help with all of the board duties and everything, but it looks like that we're going to sadly be closing down, which is our biggest update, which is
Oh,
very sad.
no.
I know, but and we can talk about this, but
Yeah.
it's really
Mhm.
sad, but at the same time, it's the best possible time, and we've been
Yeah.
speaking with, I've been speaking with the board and our leadership team, and just about if there was ever a time, the time is now, because of this really significant reform that we've been able to achieve with our campaign partners as well, and Rape on Campus Australia, Fair Agenda.
Mhm.
And yeah, so it's really, yeah,
That is bittersweet for
it is
sure.
sad, but it's really exciting, because like I said before about not wanting to be like, we don't wanna have to be needed, and we almost feel like we might get there in not 100 years, but maybe 5, and
Yeah.
that's really good, because this reform, it's a bit of a staged process, but in 5 years, almost every single university, almost every single residential hall, every private student accommodation company, all any higher education provider, whether it be accommodation or just the course, is going to be covered and forced and regulated to actually prevent and respond to sexual violence on campus.
The story of starting and as we said, kind of wanting to not be needed anymore, to put ourselves out of work, um, to doing, contributing so much over that period of time. It is, um it's challenging, as students come in as undergrads, they're new, they become involved in sexual violence work, they graduate, they move on, and so the nature of student activism on campuses is something that continues to revolve as students leave, and Sometimes there is that institutional kind of knowledge of the organization and what's been happening, but often there's not, and there's gaps. And so it can certainly be challenging from an organizational perspective to continue to move forward. Um, the reason you're no longer needed is really because of, as you say, the hard work that has happened over these past, however long. Certainly, you've been a key component of that, as well as, you mentioned eWork Australia, Fair Agenda. And I guess for those who have no idea what we're talking about, it is super excited that this week, National Ombudsman.
Yes. So,
No.
I'll give a bit of the big
Mhm.
update is that, 2 days ago, we were really excited to see and be able to go to Parliament House for our federal education minister to introduce a bill to establish a National Student Ombudsman. So, I guess going back to a year ago, or just over a year ago, we were standing myself and the STOP Campaign team were standing in Parliament House with some support from some independent senators and some Greens senators, and crossbenchers as well, to launch a campaign called #IDeserveSafety. And this was kind of our contribution to the many years of work that MRAPE on Campus and Fair Agenda and other campaign partners have been doing to try and call on some independent oversight mechanism into the university sector. The sector needs to be regulated. They need to be told what to do to prevent sexual violence and respond to it effectively and in a safe and trauma-informed manner. So we spoke with them and they just said, we need like student engagement. We need something to get this back on the radar. So that's when we came into the picture and we decided to do a lived experience campaign where we put together a video and we got to launch it to have some of our members, particularly those living on campus right now, to share their experiences of not only sexual violence, but they tried to report, nothing happened, they're being forced to live next door to their perpetrators, and universities are just continuing to betray student victim survivors, not making any accommodations. Countless people can't continue their studies because they're just turning a blind eye and saying, oh, it's all good. And, perpetrators of sexual violence are graduating and victim survivors aren't. So that ended up being really effective. We ended up doing that, and all of a sudden, we're in the Minister for Education, his office, and we're telling him what's actually happening. And literally since that day, I've been involved in the government established an expert advisory group and basically just said, we're going to do something about it. And they have actually listened to us and followed through. So back in February this year, they announced an action plan. And the action plan is to address gender-based violence in higher ed, and it has 7 actions. And the first action is a National Student Ombudsman, which now has been introduced. The bill has been introduced into Parliament, and we're hoping it'll be passed within a couple of months because it's it's been exciting. We've had like full support from the opposition. Even the opposition leader stood up and said, we support this work. So it's not contentious at this point. I think universities have just accepted defeat
Yeah,
from us.
this is what's
And
happening.
yeah, it's just awesome. So what the National Student Ombudsman does is basically at the moment in Australia, we don't have a suitable body to actually accept complaints when what I described before of when universities are failing their students in terms of people are trying to make a complaint, they're trying to report, they're trying to get support, academic concessions, anything to help them stay at university after experiencing sexual assault at the university that they're studying at. And they're just not, like, the universities are not assisting them to be able to do that or treating them with respect. So now those students basically have an external body that has the same powers as a royal commission, which means that they have coercive powers, so they can investigate, they can impose sanctions, basically. They can make recommendations and tell universities what they need to change. And they also are going to have public reporting. So the really exciting thing about this is that students have somewhere to go. They know that it'll be taken seriously. They can enter into different options like mediation, restorative engagement, investigation, really serious recommendations that are about or findings that universities have failed, and they're all about reputation. So that's a massive deal. And then the ombudsman basically has to then report all of this to Parliament, which will then be released publicly. So it's not only somewhere for students to go, but it's an accountability mechanism so that students and their parents can
Mhm.
what universities are doing well on this, what universities are not, and they can make more of an informed decision as well, future students, about where they want to study, because it's just it's not good enough, and I think this reputational tarnishing, is a really big deal, because what has happened to date is that we basically have to talk to senators, and our friends at MRAPE on Campus Australia have been talking to senators. So then every couple of months, when there's a Senate estimates where the current regulator, which does not do anything, is there, they ask, so what universities, what reports, what's happening? Because there's just no transparency around what's happening. And the government to date has been protecting the sector and letting them do this, and now they're saying no more. So it's a really big deal, but it's only step one as well. There's 6 more actions,
Absolutely.
so this is amazing. Such a big
Yeah.
deal. Yeah.
Students will still have the ability to, um, report to their schools, correct, and go down that path, and it is when that is unsatisfactory that they can then escalate that. So it's not like now just this ombudsman opens up and everything goes there. There's still opportunities for institutions to grow and learn and enhance their own prevention efforts and strategies, and internally see what reforms might be necessary. So it's really, so it creates this umbrella accountability structure, but it also hopefully will push down the responsibility to all of the individual institutions to think how they can do more for survivors, for victim survivors on campus.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's so important that when there's investigations entered into, that there'll be findings. And for the most part, unless there's some privacy concerns around individual victim survivor at very small campuses, because it goes beyond unis. It's I always say universities, but it's any higher education provider, and there's a lot of very small tertiary education registered providers as well. But for the most part, yeah, they're going to make findings, and they're going to work or attempt to work with universities to help them better their practices. So the goal is for it to be collaborative, but when they're not meeting the ombudsman where they're at, or they're not complying, then it gets a lot more serious. And something I will say that I'm really excited for, and really just so happy that they listened to us, the people who drafted this bill in the government, is that it also has a section on reprisals. So it basically talks about, that if there's a complainant, or someone's thinking about complaining, any victim survivor who goes, they're thinking about it. And if they are facing any type of targeting, bullying, if anyone is trying to get them to not complain, or they're being intimidated, there are penalties up to 6 months imprisonment. And this is a really big deal, because it's just showing them that this is really serious, and that people should be allowed to make a complaint and not experience backlash, or for their academic experience for them to be targeted, for them to then experience more barriers than they were before. And that's a really common experience. I mean, particularly with the STOP campaign, we're targeted all the time. We have student volunteers who are on our team, but they don't tell anyone because they're treated differently at their university by staff. And they won't be able to do that anymore, at least for people who are reporting to the ombudsman. So it's really it's really good to see that the government is taking it seriously, and they've listened to us about what's actually happening on the ground, because it's not that many people would really know about this. And it also talks about things like non-disclosure agreements. Like, people can't and go to someone who's had an experience and say, well, you can't go and report to them, and, force a non-disclosure agreement on them where they
Yeah.
feel like they have no other option, that's gonna be illegal it's gonna get to a point where they're not gonna be able to do that, and that is really gonna be a game changer, so
Um, you know, we're, as you know, sometimes I'm in Canada, sometimes I'm in Winnipeg, or sometimes I'm in Buffalo and New York, back and forth. And, you know, it is really, it's amazing to see um, the, uh, the, the consequences, that there's actually going to be consequences for inaction or potentially the wrong action once these reforms come into place. In the US, there is Clary compliance, there is Title IX, there are some mechanisms. And in Canada, we really don't have, there's legislation across the provinces, but there isn't necessarily a lot of um, even clear requirements, like, related to transparency or accountability, um, and I would say limited in terms of, consequences that an institution may face for not doing this. So, when I look at it, I hope that what's happening in Australia will be a model for other places, for other countries, for other communities who are looking at how they can do more and how they can do better. I'm I guess I'm wondering, kind of some of the other pieces of this. You say that the ombudsman is one part of it, increased transparency. There's going to be sanctions now available. What are some of the other pieces of it?
So the really significant other piece, and I've been working with the government on this, and so it's looking really good, and I'm really excited for it. So it's a national code to prevent and respond to gender-based violence all higher education providers. So basically, what that looks like, and as part of this bill as well, there was a summary document that the minister did table to say, just to make it really clear that this is big step 1, but big step 2 is coming. So basically what that is gonna be, it's gonna be a new piece of legislation, and it has, at the moment, I think, around 8 different, areas, and it's going to basically tell all higher education providers what they need to do in terms of the types of prevention that they have to deliver around gender-based violence on their campuses, who can deliver them, how regular this education needs to be, their communication around all of this, pardon me, their communication strategies around what's available, their staffing models. And then on the response side, it has things like how they need to respond to complaints, how they need to be trauma informed, what this means in practice. And it's extremely detailed to the point where it has, how many days you need to finish a complaint after someone has told you. It has
Yeah.
things about responding to critical incidents in colleges or on campus when something
Mhm.
happens on campus, mostly in a residential hall or a college or student accommodation, how they need to respond immediately, the safety mechanisms they need to put in place, the academic concessions they have to provide student victim survivors, the leadership in government, so how it has to be on the agenda of every council, of every university. It is just it's gonna be long, it goes on, and it's basically gonna be really prescriptive, and it's gonna work hand in hand with the ombudsman, because once it is introduced and then passed, it will basically sit there as something for students to look at and go, "Oh, my university is meant to have a policy or a process done in this way, and that's not what I experienced." So they
Mm.
can use that to go directly to the ombudsman and say, "My uni didn't do this when this happened, and now this is what the impact is on me. Can you do something about it?" So that is how it can be used, but also, after it's been in place for a year, so starting in January 2026, if it all still happens by the end of this year and on time, compliance measures are gonna start to be implemented. So the government has set up a new unit,
Mhm.
and it's going to be staffed with people that are with every single higher education provider, starting with the main universities, is they'll be looking at whether they've followed all of these very prescriptive rules. And if they haven't, they'll want to work with them and provide advice. But then it's the same. There will be consequences if they don't. And there'll also be annual reporting on how each university is doing. So the ombudsman is like,
Yes.
you've experienced it, you tried to get help in your uni, it
Yeah.
didn't happen. This is
Yeah.
actually supporting unis to do better, but also
Advocacy.
telling them exactly what to do, and they've had our input, they've had survivor input, they've had expert input, so it's looking really good. So that's really, really exciting.
That's very exciting. I was in Sydney I guess about a year ago, around this time or close to it, for the World Academic Summit. And University of Sydney around that time had released numbers related to sexual violence on campus. And I remember there was lots of chit chat about that, and you know, the the ability for institutions to make public that information, as you say, it can factor into decision making by parents, by students, prospective students, about where they might want to go. But I think, there's a public education perhaps component as well, that does a school with high numbers mean that it's an unsafe school, or does a school with high numbers mean that it is a place that students feel empowered to be able to come forward because their needs might be, they're being met, they're being heard, they're seeing change on their campus. And so it's fostering that speak up culture that can be really beneficial. And so I think there's, kind of that tendency towards, oh, a school has, look at their numbers, but really those numbers can be indicative of some really positive things.
Yeah, it can be indicative of trust. And this is something
Oh,
that myself and particularly the National Union of Students representative on this group, they keep saying, like, I know you can't regulate trust, but we've really got to build in some things around how to build that trust through some very specific like actions. And it's things like advertising what happens when someone reports, what are the different options available. It's so basic. And
yeah.
the recent National Student Safety Survey, so that original one I mentioned at the beginning in 2017, there's been a second one since. And that
Mm.
was undertaken in 2021, and the results released in 2022. And that basically said, on average, 1 in 2 students didn't even know where to report. Like, didn't even know where to report. And of people who did, they were unsatisfied with the process. So it's about like, that's a really large number of students, and
So
it's just the basic stuff of advertising what is gonna happen so that people, again, can make an informed decision or even know that the university recognizes that this happens. They need to staff it. They should have dedicated case managers. They should have, phone numbers you can call for after hours, and some unis do have it, but others don't. So this will just make it a lot more consistent, which is what's really important because the university experience, it can be good, it can be great, but it can
Mhm.
also be really harmful. And at the moment, it's just people don't necessarily have a big choice about where they go. I mean, they're all financially very different. They all offer different courses. So yeah, it'll just create more consistency and hopefully prevention that it just starts to also numbers go up in reporting and then they really actually start to stop as this prevention is undertaken every year regularly and then it gets better and better and better and hopefully then it's becoming a lot more effective.
Yeah. When we work with campus partners, who have, like, REES campus partners who've adopted the platform, that communications piece and that kind of marketing piece on campus is a really important pillar of what we do as well. Because, when students can see posters and things in the back of a washroom stall, or where they can see, video monitor content, or getting email blasts, or seeing it on a syllabus, or in a newsletter or whatever, it just fosters, like you say, building that trust, and that creating that environment where students feel encouraged that if they want to come forward, they're there's mechanisms to do that, and these are the mechanisms. And so that awareness and education piece for students, I think, is really, really a critical piece. And really, it needs to be all these things. You know what I mean? It's not a this is the answer, that you just do training and mandatory training is going to solve the problems, or consent awareness initiatives that's going to solve the problems. It's all of these things working together in a coordinated way. Um, it's Consent Week in Canada, so we're excited about that, and it's a time really to focus here on just raising awareness. School started for us, I guess, last week or the week before in most schools in North America. It's a time where people are actively talking about the red zone and the higher risk that occurs for students during the first 6 to 8 weeks of school. Do you think, kind of the things that are happening in Australia will bring a quick change? You know what I mean? Like, do you think it's going to be like you said 5 years? Like, do you really think that? Or what do
I
you what do you think?
think it's such a good question. Well, I think with this reform, the first 2 years are going to be messy. I
Mm,
think it's gonna be a lot of reports to the ombudsman, a lot of universities kicking up a fuss, a lot of them getting very, very mad about, and this has been my experience engaging with some of them recently, is that they are some of them are extremely frustrated they're not being given money to do this. I think it's gonna take a while for universities to recognize that keeping students safe is a part of doing business,
yeah, absolutely.
and so that is the biggest barrier at the moment, is university leadership. They're gonna be,
Mhm.
of course, like, they're gonna have to come on board because you wanna look good in these reports. They're gonna wanna do the right thing eventually because there's all these public accountability mechanisms in place. When it comes to the actual prevention, it's interesting because I don't think there's that many providers of effective prevention in universities specifically that are catering it to university contexts.
Mm,
And but I still think if they're being forced to kind of comply and show how they're delivering education on consent and ethical sex and responding to disclosures, and here's where to report, and here's are all your options,
mhm,
after they've been through compliance 3, 4,
mm.
5
Yeah.
times, I am really hopeful by the
Mhm.
6th year that they're really being told
Yeah.
to kick it,
Mm.
like, to they've done it so many times already. It's not gonna prevent violence from happening full stop, but I think I think it's possible for it to be, for campuses to generally be safe, to at least
Yeah.
everyone gets to learn about consent.
Yeah.
Everyone knows where to go within their first week if something happens.
Yeah.
Hopefully, they built trust, and if they do go, they actually get positive,
Support
a
line. Yeah.
supportive response. And,
Yeah.
the biggest barrier I think of who will come along is probably going to be within the classroom, because a lot of people who are teaching content, they're on casual contracts and things like that. So, I'm sure there'll still be issues in the classroom around content that's maybe inappropriate, or some people aren't following the rules about providing academic concessions or support. But I think eventually they'll get there, and I hope it's closer to 5 years than 10 years. That's what I hope.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So there's no funding being attached to development of this, or
There's
the requirements for the tools?
there's 38 million over, I think it was 3 years, to establish this, but it's all going into setting it up within government. So it's all about the government
Mm.
funding it all, creating all those people that are going to work in this compliance area, the
Yeah.
legislation, the National Student Ombudsman. At the moment, it's going to sit within the Commonwealth Ombudsman. I don't know if it'll be there forever. If it
Oh,
grows and grows, it could be its new thing. So, but the money isn't being given to the sector. Like, it's not being given to universities, and they're not happy about that. But they've had a really long time to do
yeah.
this. We shouldn't actually have to be doing this. This should have been implemented in 2017 when the Human Rights Commission report came out. That was almost, I think, their last opportunity to do something about it, and they still haven't. There is a university that I recently attended, and it's national, and there's 7 campuses across the whole country, and they have one person to
Oh,
do
wow.
all sexual violence prevention, it's an impossible job.
Yeah. No,
So,
absolutely.
they're still not taking it seriously because they're not actually investing. The university leadership is not investing in student safety by creating whole teams and resourcing the work properly. And I think it's just they're gonna have to, but they'll be putting money into other places, and vice chancellors, some of them get $1.8 million a year. One of the vice chancellors last year earned that much down the road from me at a
That's a
local
lot of
university.
prevention dollars. That's a lot of
Like,
prevention dollars.
that's a lot of
Mhm,
prevention dollars. So, I don't know, I think there's money, and I spoke
mhm.
to people in the US about this. They were like, "We're all, working second jobs, and they're doing amazing, but the coach of the football team is also on millions." So, they just need to think about prioritization, and in the long run, they'll save themselves a lot of money, and this is really important work. So, it's worth the investment, and comparatively to other areas of the uni, it's actually not that expensive comparatively. Like,
Will
it's not.
will there be fines in as part of the, um, kind of the sanctions? Will there be fines that can be
Yeah,
allocated so
yeah,
that there's more
fines is
financial?
an yeah, so fines will definitely be an option from.
Mhm.
I feel like I can imagine that they'll really wanna try and do
Yeah,
find, like, to try and get them to come along.
yeah.
Um, but I can imagine if it's very serious, they will go down that path of actually finding people, and that would probably be more in relation to not complying with the code.
Mm, mhm.
More so than the student ombudsman. I think the student ombudsman is really gonna try and do this as collaboratively as possible, and so will the people leading the code, the government. But if some unis or providers really can if they're doing really harmful things and they're failing their compliance and then they fail again the next year on the
Mm.
same thing, I think that's when it will get a lot more serious. So if they're failing on the same things 2 years in a row, I think that's when perhaps we'll start to see more serious things in place, like fines. But I think they're gonna try and be collaborative, which I would completely agree with in the initial
Well, that's
stage.
what you want. Hope that it will bring about the change,
We
that it
want
will
them to
bring.
want to do it as well. Yeah.
And certainly here and, in the US, there can be that combination of fines and then sometimes reporting as well, or in Canada where there's been recommendations. I think in Canada, there's probably not fines in any significant way. I can't think of examples of that, because there's not the requirements on the schools in Canada, like the clear, tangible, concrete requirements on them. Um, so it'll be interesting to watch as things evolve, in Australia and see what the response is and see how this rolls out and see
Yeah.
how it works. I'm about 30 years older than you, and this issue hasn't changed since I was a student. It's not a new issue. It's not new on campuses. It's not new in higher education or centers of learning. Um, it's being talked about, but it's been around for a really long time. And I guess a question that I have for you is like, why now? What do you think? We've had Me Too. We've had there's been lots of things going on. What do you think was different here? Um, and Minister Clare has been, um, he has been the face of we're moving this forward and we see this as an issue. But I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on why now? Why is this change happening?
I honestly think so, last year, last year it came out during a Senate inquiry into consent laws. So, not university sexual violence.
Okay.
During that inquiry, it started to come to light from some of the senators that were on this committee that there had been mismanagement of funds by the university peak body Universities Australia, where they were provided $1.5 million or about thereabouts to develop a consent campaign across all
Oh.
universities.
Mhm.
And they didn't do it in the end, didn't really disclose how they spent the money, and then released a little 20-page PDF that was basically a copy paste of
Mm.
something another organization had done a couple of years prior. And because this came to light during an inquiry into consent laws, it kind of ended up turning into consent laws and consent education in schools and university, and it just kept going. It kept broadening its scope as all of these
Mhm.
things were coming to light. And that coming out in a Senate inquiry, because you cannot lie in a Senate
Yeah.
inquiry, and the chief executive at the time of Universities Australia was basically caught lying and trying to mislead the committee, and that was really serious to the public and
Mhm.
to the government. So these are senators of, not government at of the day, but the current government of the day, the Labor government, were pretty appalled with how
Mm.
this had all been handled as well. And I think that coming
Mm.
out, which Shana Bremner from Emory Pond Campus, Australia, was a massive part in all of this and has been campaigning for years. But
Yeah.
that combined with us going into Parliament and
Mhm.
doing the I Deserve Safety last year, I think
Yeah.
we've just had the right people in the right positions at the right time,
Mhm.
because talking to our campaign partners, Fair Agenda, Emory Park Campus, and Dr. Alison Henry, they were in
Mhm.
Parliament calling for this years ago in previous governments, and they did not care. They did not want to engage in this, the previous government. And I
Yeah.
think we're really lucky that Jason Clare is the education minister and not someone else, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Yeah.
He is, I've never met a politician like him who's actually an elected politician in the major party, who has to
Mhm.
draw party lines, who
Yeah.
has been so, insistent on changing this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, even the other day, because I get really emotional, and I was crying and he was crying, and I think he genuinely cares,
Yeah.
and he must have some influence in the party for them to say, "Let's get this over the line." So I
Yeah.
don't know what it is, but I think that Senate inquiry and that fact that they probably came to the realization that, yeah, the peak body is not gonna genuinely engage in this. They've mismanaged government funds. I think that's the last straw. Do they
Mhm.
really wanna change the culture? No, probably not. And the senior public servants as well, the people who are kind of leading it from the government, like the actual public servants who are doing this, I mean, they also have been just amazing, and they just have put universities in their place. And again, I think it's right people, right time. If
Yeah.
we had any other I've worked in the public service. If you had any other public servant who probably, like, didn't really care that much, saw doing
Yep.
this work as a bit of a promotion opportunity, not because they're that passionate about it, we probably wouldn't have had them stand up to vice chancellors, because it's their reputation on the line as well. If
Absolutely.
So
Mhm.
we've just had people that have put the work above their reputation, and I think being in the room with the minister, the 5 of us sitting there going
Yeah.
around and saying, "Oh, and this happened to me, and no, it wasn't 10 years ago, it was, like, 3 weeks ago, 3 months ago. This is happening to me now." I
Mhm.
think that really put it in perspective of me saying, "This is what was happening to me in 2018," and then people
Mhm.
sitting there and saying, "And this also happened to me 3 weeks ago."
Yeah.
So, it just I think it was, yeah, right people, right positions, right time, and that public accountability of, um, seeing organizations not doing the right thing.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes that's what it is, right? All the work over so many years, decades, all the efforts, all the activism, and at the end of the day, it comes down to the people who happen to be listening or they're ready to listen. They're ready to hear you. They're ready to say, okay, enough. And how do we make meaningful change?
Yeah, and this is more than 50 years of student activism. Like, I don't think that it's definitely not just, what's happened in the past 12 months. It has just been accumulating. Like, walking the halls of Parliament House the other day, the amount of people that would just come up to us and go, "Oh my gosh, I was a women's officer 30
Oh,
years ago. Like, thank you for doing this." Like, there have been people that have been so many people have worked on this, but we
mhm.
just so yeah, it's just a massive collective effort, and it's been on the radar for a long time, but I don't think we had anyone willing to front up to chancellors who are mostly ex-politicians and very, very powerful
Yes.
people in our society, and vice chancellors similarly. So we just had people that were willing to put victim survivors above their, personal reputation in terms of being buddy-buddy with the academic sector.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations. I saw the posts on social media, the celebrating, and certainly you all have a lot to be proud of and, excited about as you move along into these next steps of seeing what's going to happen. And will you continue to be part of the conversations moving forward?
Yeah, so even though sadly the STOP campaign is slowly
Mhm.
coming to a
Yeah.
close, I certainly want to stay. I'm gonna keep doing things, whether it's as an individual or if there's like future campaigning to come. It'll just be from a different perspective at this point in
Mhm.
my life. But
Mhm.
yeah, I feel like I've really in too deep. I've made I wouldn't say I've made a lot of enemies, but I've ruffled a lot of feathers in the university space.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'd like to keep doing that because it's really important to me. And there's not enough people focusing on universities. Like, this big reform, we just need to get it right, make sure the code is right, to be there alongside for implementation, monitor it. I don't think it'll be as intensive as trying to get it to happen, but there'll still certainly be work to do to make sure that universities comply and that they're still doing the right thing and that we're all helping them to be able to do that. And I know my Churchill can help because there were so many amazing like organizations and people doing great stuff overseas that looking to what they're doing is they do that and they'll comply with all of this new legislation. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, there'll be lots of opportunity for learning from and taking from what's happening in other
Yeah, and I
places.
hope that, when I was overseas, I thought, "Oh god, Australia is so bad. Like, Australia is so bad." And I just can't believe now it'll be a couple of years later and I'll go, "Oh, I think Australia is now the world leader." And that's really
Yeah,
exciting that
that's
the change has happened really, really fast.
yeah.
And hopefully it will be something that, yeah, like you said, that Canada and other nations can hopefully look to. I mean, we can do some global advocacy. I'm so ready for it if that's what the next step is, because
Yeah.
it's just, yeah, there were so many similarities of what people were experiencing. And I just thought, oh my God, is this a copy paste? This is a copy paste of my
Copy
uni.
paste,
And I was just in Canada and going, oh my gosh, this is literally
lots of
the
copy
exact
paste.
same. Yeah.
Mhm, and so many good, so many people, trying to reinvent the wheel about this type of training and this type of, initiatives or campaigns and stuff. And so the ability to even be more coordinated, have more coordinated efforts from a prevention types of prevention offerings, and what works and evidence-based. I know Latrobe has some work going on that they're doing related to sexual violence partners, and so it's an exciting time. It's an exciting time looking to Australia if other countries and other schools want to also go, oh, how do we utilize what's happening elsewhere
Yeah.
to think about ourselves and how we can create safer campuses as well.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Totally.
So it'll be interesting to see. Well, I appreciate you taking time to be part of the REES community today and spending time with me. Yeah, it's been amazing to watch. to sit on the sidelines watching
No,
from.
thank you. And thank you for all you do. And if anyone wants to learn more, reach out, contact me. I'm always down for a rant, a chat, share more info. There's so much always. There's so much happening. But yeah, no, thank you for having me and just platforming this work as well on the global stage and particularly during Consent Week. I think it's always like good to turn our attention to this in a dedicated manner as well. And raising awareness is so important, and it's such a really important first step as well to reach not the people that are already they're already working
Yeah,
in it, but the broader
yeah,
community, which can be really
absolutely.
hard sometimes. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, it can. But again, congratulations on all your work. Take care, and we'll be in touch again sometime soon.
Thanks so much. See you
Okay.
later.
Okay, thanks. Bye bye.